a carefully hidden identity that concealed one of the most powerful women in tech, and the simple farmer's daughter, whose rejection letter would trigger a chain of events that even the college president couldn't contain. Before we dive into this extraordinary story of power, prejudice, and poetic justice, tell us where you're watching from in the comments, and if this intrigues you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something truly remarkable for you. The pristine corridors of Westridge Academy echoed with Professor Richard Harrington's confident footsteps as he made his way to the admissions committee meeting. At 52, the distinguished literature professor wore his academic pedigree like armor: Princeton undergraduate, Oxford doctorate, and 20 years at this prestigious private college that prided itself on its exclusive 8% acceptance rate. "Ladies and gentlemen," he nodded, taking his seat at the mahogany table. As chair of the Humanities department, Harrington wielded considerable influence over who would enter the hallowed halls of what U.S. News consistently ranked among the top liberal arts colleges in the nation. Dean Margaret Wilson slid a folder toward him. "Richard, I'd like you to reconsider this one. The application is quite remarkable." Harrington's eyebrow arched as he flipped open the folder revealing Abigail Hayes's application, a student from rural Fairfield County with perfect SAT scores and an impressive writing portfolio. "Another farm girl with good test scores," he remarked dismissively. "They perform well in their underfunded schools because there's no real competition, then flounder when faced with our curriculum and the sophistication of our student body." Her writing sample was extraordinary, Professor Chen countered. "Her analysis shows remarkable insight and maturity. And her recommendation letters are stellar," added Dean Wilson. Harrington leaned back. "Recommendation letters from teachers at Fairfield County High School hardly carry the weight of those from Phillips Exeter or Dalton. This young woman grew up on a working farm. Can you imagine her at our donor dinners?" "That's hardly relevant to her academic potential," Professor Chen objected. "It's entirely relevant to our institution's culture," Harrington replied coolly. "Westridge produces graduates who navigate the highest echelons of society. Cultural fit matters as much as academic ability." The debate continued briefly, but Harrington's influence prevailed. The final decision was 3-2 against accepting Abigail Hayes. "I'll draft the rejection letter personally," he announced, sliding the folder into his briefcase. "She deserves more than a form letter." That evening, in his book-lined office overlooking the manicured campus, Harrington crafted what he considered a thoughtful rejection. "While your academic achievements are commendable, Westridge Academy seeks students whose background and experiences prepare them for the unique social and cultural environment of our campus community." Satisfied with his diplomatic phrasing, he signed the letter and placed it in the outgoing mail, giving no further thought to the young woman whose future he had just altered. 200 miles away, in the rolling farmlands of Fairfield County, 18-year-old Abigail Hayes collected eggs from the henhouse before dawn, her mind filled with dreams of literature seminars at Westridge Academy. Unlike her classmates, who viewed their rural upbringing as a limitation, Abby took quiet pride in the fifth-generation farm that had shaped her work ethic and worldview. "Morning, sweetheart," her mother Catherine called as Abby entered through the mudroom. At 48, Catherine Hayes maintained the practical appearance of a farmer's wife: minimal makeup, practical clothing, her dark hair often pulled back in a simple ponytail. "The mail should come today," Abby mentioned, trying to sound casual though. Her heart raced at the thought of the Westridge decision letter. Catherine squeezed her daughter's shoulder reassuringly. "Whatever happens, you've made us incredibly proud." Abby's father, James, entered, his weathered face creasing into a smile. "What's on the agenda today besides wearing out the driveway watching for the mail truck?" "Very funny, Dad," Abby replied. though she couldn't help glancing toward the window that offered a view of their long gravel driveway. The Hayes family moved through their morning routine. James heading out to check irrigation systems. Catherine disappearing into her home office where she handled the farm's business affairs, and Abby finishing chores before her final high school classes. When the mail truck finally appeared around noon, Abby's hands trembled as she sorted through the stack, her heart sinking when she spotted the thin envelope bearing the Westridge Academy crest. Everyone knew a thin envelope meant rejection. Alone in her bedroom, a space that reflected her competing worlds, with agricultural trophies alongside literary classics, Abby opened the letter and read Professor Harrington's carefully worded rejection. Tears blurred her vision at phrases like cultural environment and more suitable institutions, the subtle classism beneath the polite academic language cutting deeper than outright rejection would have. When Catherine found her daughter an hour later, Abby silently handed over the letter, watching as her mother's expression shifted from sympathy to something harder, more resolute. "So that's how it is," Catherine said quietly, carefully refolding the letter. "It's fine, Mom," Abby insisted, wiping away tears. "Maybe he's right. Maybe I wouldn't fit in there anyway." Catherine was uncharacteristically silent before asking, "Do you mind if I make a copy of this letter for my files?" "Why would you want to keep a rejection letter?" Abby asked. "Documentation purposes," Catherine replied vaguely. "You never know when you might need to reference something like this." That evening, after Abby had gone to sleep, Catherine sat in her office, a surprisingly high-tech space that contrasted with the farmhouse's rustic character. 3 large monitors displayed complex data analytics, investment portfolios, and communication threads with teams across multiple time zones. She picked up a secure satellite phone, not the regular cell phone she used for day-to-day communications, and dialed a number from memory. "Marcus, it's Hayes," she said when the call connected. "I need the jet tomorrow morning, and clear my schedule for the next 48 hours. She paused, listening. "No, not a market emergency, something more personal. And Marcus, have the team pull everything they can find on Professor Richard Harrington at Westridge Academy. Full background, financial history, publications, social connections, everything." After ending the call, Catherine opened her laptop and began typing an email to Westridge Academy's president, requesting an urgent meeting the following afternoon regarding a matter of significant concern to the future of the institution. What Abby didn't know as she slept that night, dreaming of alternate futures that didn't include Westridge Academy, was that her mother's seemingly simple request for a copy of the rejection letter had set in motion events that would rock the prestigious institution to its foundations. Catherine Hayes, known in Fairfield County as a farmer's wife who managed the business side of their successful organic operation, was about to reveal her true identity as Catherine Hayes Morgan, the intensely private founder and CEO of Quantum Sphere Technologies, whose revolutionary quantum encryption algorithms had built a technology empire worth billions, and whose name regularly appeared on Forbes's list of the most powerful women in business. And she was about to teach Professor Richard Harrington a lesson in misjudging appearances that neither he nor Westridge Academy would ever forget. The morning sun had barely crested the rolling hills surrounding Westridge Academy when the campus security office received an unusual call. An executive helicopter had requested permission to land on the lacrosse field adjacent to the administration building, a request unprecedented in the college's 175-year history. "I'm sorry, but we don't have facilities for aircraft landings," explained the bewildered security director into his phone. "The nearest helipad is at Memorial Hospital, about 3 miles from campus." "This isn't a request," came the cool, professional response. "This is a courtesy notification. Ms. Hayes Morgan's pilot has already received clearance from local aviation authorities for a temporary landing. Campus security is being informed as a professional courtesy. The helicopter will arrive at precisely 10:15 a.m. Inside the administration building, the day was proceeding with its usual academic rhythm. Professor Richard Harrington was holding court in the faculty lounge, regaling younger colleagues with tales from the previous evening's Literary Society dinner, where he'd been seated next to a Pulitzer Prize winner. "Richard," interrupted his assistant, slightly breathless from hurrying across campus. "President Whitmore needs you in his office immediately." "I have a class at 11, Harrington replied, checking his watch with a practiced gesture that displayed his vintage Patek Philippe, a gift from a grateful former student whose family name adorned one of Manhattan's most prestigious investment firms. He said immediately, "Sir." He seemed unusually concerned. Something in his assistant's tone cut through Harrington's customary nonchalance. In 15 years working with President Whitmore, he had rarely been summoned with such urgency. Arriving at the president's office, Harrington was surprised to find not just Whitmore, but the entire executive leadership team assembled, their expressions uniformly tense. "Richard, come in," Whitmore gestured, his normally composed demeanor noticeably strained. "We have a situation developing that directly involves you." "Me? What's happened?" Harrington asked, glancing around at the concerned faces. "We received an email last night from Catherine Hayes Morgan requesting an immediate meeting regarding, and I quote, a matter of significant concern to the future of the institution. She specifically asked that you be present." Whitmore handed him a printout of the email. Harrington frowned. "Hayes Morgan, the name isn't familiar. The university's development director, responsible for donor relations and endowments, cleared her throat. Catherine Hayes Morgan is the founder and CEO of Quantum Sphere Technologies. Intensely private, rarely gives interviews. Her net worth is estimated at just over $8.7 billion, and she's requested a meeting with me. Why?" Harrington's confusion was genuine. "That's what concerns us," President Whitmore replied. "The only connection we can establish is that yesterday you signed a rejection letter to an applicant named Abigail Hayes from Fairfield County." Harrington waved dismissively. "One of dozens. A farm girl with good test scores but questionable. A cultural fit. What would that have to do with a tech billionaire?" The development director's expression tightened. "Hayes Morgan is famously protective of her privacy. She lives on a working farm in Fairfield County with her husband James Hayes, a fifth-generation farmer. They have one daughter." The implication hung heavy in the air as Harrington's face drained of color. "You can't be serious." "Her helicopter will be landing in approximately 10 minutes, Whitmore confirmed grimly. "Whatever your reasoning was for rejecting Ms. Hayes's application, you're about to explain it to her mother, one of the wealthiest and most influential women in the technology sector." As if to punctuate his statement, the distant sound of helicopter rotors became audible through the office windows. Outside on the lacrosse field, students and faculty gathered at a safe distance, phones raised to record the unprecedented arrival. The sleek black helicopter bearing only a discreet QST logo touched down with precision, its rotors stirring the manicured grass. When the door opened, the crowd murmured in confusion. The woman who emerged looked nothing like what most expected of a tech billionaire. Catherine Hayes Morgan wore simple, tailored clothes, expensive but understated, with her silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a practical style. Only the three stern-looking individuals who exited behind her, 2 men and a woman in impeccable business attire, suggested this was someone of significance. "That's Hayes Morgan," whispered one faculty member to another. "She looks like she could be one of our Midwestern students' mothers." "Don't be fooled," replied his colleague. "I'd read she once reduced a Fortune 50 CEO to tears during acquisition negotiations. They call her the Quiet Destroyer in Silicon Valley." As Catherine walked across campus, She nodded politely to staring students, but maintained a purposeful pace toward the administration building. She carried only a slim leather portfolio, inside which was her daughter's rejection letter, along with a dossier on Professor Richard Harrington that would have made the professor deeply uncomfortable had he known of its existence. In the president's conference room, tension mounted as Catherine was escorted in. The three individuals accompanying her remained outside, taking positions that subtly but effectively blocked the corridor. Ms. Hayes Morgan, welcome to Westridge Academy. President Whitmore began, extending his hand. I'm Charles Whitmore, and this is Professor Richard Harrington, Catherine completed, her voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of steel. Chair of Humanities, graduate of Princeton and Oxford, author of 3 books on early American literature, and the person who wrote this letter to my daughter. She placed Abigail's rejection letter on the table, aligned with perfect precision. Ms. Hayes Morgan, please understand that our admissions process is highly competitive, Whitmore began diplomatically. Only 8% of applicants. I'm not here about your acceptance rate, President Whitmore, Catherine interrupted smoothly. I'm here about the specific language in this rejection letter. She turned to Harrington. Perhaps you could explain what you meant by suggesting my daughter's background doesn't prepare her for the unique social and cultural environment of Westridge Academy. Harrington shifted uncomfortably. Ms. Hayes Morgan, I assure you no disrespect was intended. We simply try to create a student body where everyone will thrive socially as well as academically. And you determined my daughter, who has perfect SAT scores, exemplary recommendations, and a writing portfolio that your own colleagues found extraordinary, wouldn't thrive socially because she lives on a farm. Catherine's voice remained conversational, making her words all the more devastating. There's a significant adjustment period for students from rural backgrounds, Harrington attempted to explain. The socioeconomic diversity can be challenging. Socioeconomic diversity, Catherine repeated, the hint of a smile touching her lips, an interesting concern. Tell me, Professor Harrington, did you research my daughter's background before making assumptions about her socioeconomic status? Our admissions process evaluates the whole student, Harrington replied stiffly. We consider their environment, opportunities, and preparation for— You made assumptions, Catherine interrupted again, based on an address and an occupation. You saw farmer and created a narrative in your mind about who my daughter is and what she's capable of handling. President Whitmore attempted to regain control of the increasingly uncomfortable conversation. Ms. Hayes Morgan, I assure you, we value diversity of all kinds at Westridge. If there's been a misunderstanding about your daughter's application, there's been no misunderstanding, Catherine replied evenly. Professor Harrington was perfectly clear. He rejected my daughter because of her perceived social class, not her academic qualifications or potential. She opened her portfolio and extracted several more documents. I've taken the liberty of reviewing Westridge's admissions data for the past 5 years. There's a concerning pattern of rural and working-class student rejections, despite academic credentials equal to or exceeding those of accepted applicants. The president's face paled. How did you access that data? Catherine smiled thinly. Let's just say data is my specialty. Quantum spheres algorithms can identify patterns others miss, whether in quantum computing or, as it happens, in college admissions practices. She placed another document on the table. A detailed statistical analysis showing clear evidence of bias in Westridge's admissions towards students from wealthy zip codes and prestigious preparatory schools, even when controlling for academic and qualifications. This would make for a fascinating exposé in the Chronicle of Higher Education, Catherine observed, or perhaps the New York Times education section. The implied threat hung in the air like a gathering storm. Prestigious institutions like Westridge depended on their reputation for fair and merit-based admissions, particularly in an era of increasing scrutiny over privilege in elite education. Professor Harrington, his composure finally cracking, leaned forward. "What exactly do you want, Miss Hayes Morgan? For us to admit your daughter despite our professional judgment?" Catherine's gaze turned icy. "My daughter doesn't know I'm here, Professor, and she certainly doesn't know who I really am. Abby believes, as does everyone in our community, that I'm simply Catherine Hayes, a farmer's wife who handles our business, operations." This revelation clearly surprised everyone in the room. "Why would you hide your identity from your own daughter?" Whitmore asked. "Because I wanted her to develop her own sense of self, untainted by wealth or others' expectations," Catherine replied. "My husband and I agreed when we moved to the farm that we would raise her with values of hard work and integrity, away from the distorting influence of extreme privilege. She believes our farm is moderately successful, and it is. But she has no idea about quantum sphere or my role there." She turned back to Harrington. "So no, Professor, I don't want you to admit Abby against your judgment. What I want is something far more substantial, a complete overhaul of Westridge's admissions process to eliminate the bias you've institutionalized." President Whitmore, recognizing both the threat and opportunity before him, straightened in his chair. "Perhaps we should discuss what such changes might look like, Ms. Hayes Morgan." What no one in that room could know was that this confrontation was about to escalate far beyond a wealthy parent challenging an admissions decision. Catherine Hayes Morgan had not built a technology empire by thinking small, and her plans for Westridge Academy extended far beyond her daughter's rejection letter. And Professor Richard Harrington, who had arrived at this meeting confident in his academic authority, would soon discover that questioning the intellectual and social qualifications of a farmer's daughter had triggered consequences that would reshape his career and the institution he had served for 2 decades. The conference room had fallen silent as Catherine Hayes Morgan's words hung in the air. President Whitmore, a man who had navigated the treacherous waters of academic politics for over 20 years, recognized both the threat and opportunity before him. "Ms. Hayes Morgan," he began carefully, "while I'm deeply concerned by your analysis, I want to assure you that Westridge has been working to address socio-economic diversity. Our scholarship program has expanded by 30% over the past 5 years. Catherine's expression remained impassive. Scholarships for a handful of token students doesn't address systemic bias in your selection process." She turned to and faced Professor Harrington directly. "Would you like to know what my daughter did after receiving your rejection letter, Professor?" Harrington, still visibly uncomfortable, cleared his throat. "I imagine she was disappointed, as are many applicants." "She defended you," Catherine interrupted, a hint of emotion finally breaking through her composed exterior. "She said perhaps you were right, that maybe she wouldn't fit in at Westridge. My brilliant daughter, who has never scored below a perfect grade, who reads Dostoevsky for pleasure and writes poetry that has already been published in national journals, questioned her own worth because you decided her background made her unsuitable." The room fell silent again, the weight of this revelation landing heavily on everyone present. Even Harrington seemed momentarily chastened. "What exactly are you proposing, Ms. Hayes Morgan?" President Whitmore asked, recognizing that they had moved beyond discussion to negotiation. Catherine opened her portfolio again and extracted a multi-page document. "I've prepared a comprehensive proposal for reforming Westridge's admissions and process. The highlights include blind first-round reviews where socioeconomic indicators are removed, a rebalancing of how extracurricular activities are weighted to account for students who work to support their families, and mandatory bias training for all admissions staff and committee members." She passed copies to everyone at the table. "You'll find it's extensively researched and incorporates best practices from institutions that have successfully addressed similar bias issues. As the Westridge officials quickly scanned the document, their expressions reflected varying degrees of surprise and concern. The proposal was indeed comprehensive, and implementing it would fundamentally change how admissions decisions were made. This would require significant organizational changes, Whitmore observed, trying to buy time. Our board would need to— I've already spoken with 3 members of your board, Catherine replied smoothly. They find the proposal intriguing, particularly in light of the data analysis I shared with them early this morning. Whitmore's head snapped up. You contacted our board members directly? I believe in efficiency, Catherine said with a slight shrug. And as it happens, 2 of your board members sit on technology investment committees that have funded quantum sphere ventures. We had much to discuss. The implication was clear. Catherine Hayes Morgan had not arrived unprepared for this. Confrontation. She had mapped the entire power structure of Westridge Academy and already begun building the alliances necessary to effect change, regardless of the outcome of this meeting. Professor Harrington, his academic arrogance finally giving way to a more pragmatic assessment of the situation, leaned forward. These changes would take considerable time to implement, certainly not in time for the current admissions cycle. I'm aware, Catherine agreed, which brings me to the second part of my proposal. From her portfolio, she produced another document, thinner this time, but no less impactful. Westridge has been trying to establish a computer science department for years, but has struggled to attract suitable faculty or secure necessary funding for state-of-the-art facilities. President Whitmore couldn't hide his surprise. That information isn't public. As I said, data is my specialty, Catherine replied. I'm prepared to endow a Center for Computational Ethics at Westridge with full funding for faculty, facilities, and scholarships for students from underrepresented backgrounds. The center would focus on the ethical implications of emerging technologies, an area desperately needed in today's educational landscape. The proposal was staggering, potentially the largest single donation in Westridge's history for a small liberal arts college perpetually competing with wealthier institutions for top students and faculty. Such an endowment could be transformative. That's extremely generous, Whitmore managed, clearly recalibrating his approach to the situation. There are conditions, Catherine continued. First, the admissions reforms must be fully implemented according to the timeline in my proposal, with transparent reporting on progress. Second, the center must actively recruit students from rural and working-class backgrounds who show aptitude in both technology and ethical reasoning. And third, she paused, making eye contact with each person at the table, Professor Harrington will serve as faculty liaison to the Admissions Reform Committee, personally overseeing the implementation of the new bias mitigation protocols. Harrington blanched. That's outside my area of expertise entirely. Precisely, Catherine replied. The best way to understand systemic bias is to actively work to dismantle it. You'll receive extensive training, of course, and will work alongside diversity specialists. Consider it an opportunity for professional growth. The refined humiliation of this condition was not lost on anyone in the room. Harrington would essentially be serving penance for his biased approach, while also being unable to refuse given the enormous benefit to the institution. President Whitmore, whose instinct for institutional survival had served him well throughout his career, recognized the moment for what it was. A perfectly constructed scenario where accepting Catherine's terms was the only viable option. We would need to present this to the full board, but speaking personally, I find your proposal both generous and thoughtful, he said carefully. The Center for Computational Ethics would address a significant gap in liberal arts education nationwide. Catherine nodded, acknowledging the tentative acceptance. There's one more thing, she added, her tone shifting slightly. My daughter still doesn't know about my professional identity, and I would prefer to keep it that way for now. You don't want us to admit her? Whitmore asked, confused. I want you to reconsider her application on its merits alone, following the new protocols I've outlined. If she's admitted, it should be because she deserves to be, not because her mother made a large donation. Catherine's principles were evident in her unwavering gaze. If she's admitted, no one is to know about this meeting or my connection to Westridge. Professor Harrington, despite his discomfort, found himself mildly impressed by this stance. Many wealthy parents he had encountered would have simply demanded their child's admission as part of the deal. As the meeting continued to hash out details of the agreement, a different scene was unfolding at Fairfield County High School, where Abigail Hayes sat in her advanced placement literature class, unaware of her mother's dramatic confrontation at Westridge. Their teacher had asked them to discuss themes of identity and social class in Great Expectations, and Abby found herself drawing unexpected parallels to her own recent rejection. Pip assumes that becoming a gentleman will make him worthy of Estella, she commented to the class, but the novel ultimately shows that true worth comes from character and actions, not social position. Excellent point, Abby, her teacher encouraged. Dickens repeatedly challenges Victorian class assumptions. How might that apply to contemporary society? Abby thought for a moment. I think we still often confuse markers of status, like where someone went to school or where they live, with actual ability or character. It's an easy shortcut, but usually a false one. Her teacher nodded approvingly, noticing how the normally reserved student seemed particularly engaged with the topic. What neither of them knew was that Abby's thoughtful analysis was being shaped by her very personal experience of class-based rejection. After school, Abby drove her battered pickup truck, a 16th birthday gift from her parents that she had helped restore, toward the local community college. While Westridge had been her dream school, she was practical enough to have backup plans. The community college offered strong transfer programs, and she had an appointment with an advisor to discuss her options. As she waited in the modest administrative building, scrolling through course offerings on her phone, she received a text from her father. Mom had to fly out suddenly for a farm equipment emergency. Don't worry, everything's fine. I'll handle evening chores. Love you. Abby frowned slightly. Her mother occasionally traveled to agricultural conferences or supplier meetings, but flying out was unusual phrasing, as was the short notice. Still, their farm operation had become increasingly complex over the years, with specialty organic products shipping to high-end restaurants across the Northeast. Equipment emergencies happened, and her mother was the one who handled the business side of things. What Abby couldn't possibly know was that at that very moment, her mother was concluding negotiations that would not only transform Westridge Academy's approach to diversity and inclusion, but potentially impact higher education admissions policies nationwide. As the meeting at Westridge finally concluded with tentative agreements in place pending board approval, Catherine prepared to depart. The helicopter would return her to a private airfield where her company jet waited to fly her back home, hopefully before Abby returned from school. One last question, Ms. Hayes Morgan, President Whitmore said as he walked her to the door. Why go to such lengths for systemic change? Many in your position would have simply used their influence to reverse a single admissions decision. Catherine paused, considering her response carefully. When I started QuantumSphere, every venture capital firm in Silicon Valley told me my background wasn't the right fit. I didn't come from Stanford or MIT, didn't have the right connections, didn't look the part of a tech founder. Her expression hardened slightly at the memory. I succeeded despite those biases, not because someone removed them from my path, but that doesn't mean the biases themselves shouldn't be dismantled. She met his gaze directly. My daughter deserves to be judged on her abilities, not her zip code, and so does every other student with the talent and drive to excel here. This isn't just about Abby, it's about fixing a broken system that wastes human potential based on arbitrary markers of status and belonging. As Catherine's helicopter lifted off from the lacrosse field, observed by hundreds of students now recording the departure on their phones, the video that would later go viral across campus, Professor Harrington stood at his office window watching the aircraft disappear into the distance. On his desk lay the admissions folder for Abigail Hayes, which he had retrieved to review after the meeting. Reading it carefully now, without the lens of his previous bias, he was struck by what he had missed, the exceptional quality of her writing, the depth of her analytical thinking, and the unique perspective she would bring to classroom discussions. Next, to the folder lay Catherine's proposal for reforming the admissions process, with his name prominently featured as faculty liaison to the implementation committee. His comfortable academic world had been irrevocably disrupted by a farmer's wife, who turned out to be one of the most powerful women in American business, a humbling reminder that appearances rarely tell the complete story about anyone. What he couldn't know, as he contemplated the changes ahead, was that Catherine Hayes Morgan's intervention at Westridge Academy was about to attract national attention to issues of class bias in elite college admissions, triggering a conversation that would reach all the way to the Department of Education and the highest levels of government. And in the quiet farmhouse in Fairfield County, Abigail Hayes was about to discover that her rejection letter had set in motion events that would not only reshape her future, but potentially transform educational opportunity for thousands of students like her across the country. News of the mysterious helicopter landing spread through Westridge Academy like wildfire. Social media buzzed with speculation about the elegantly dressed visitor who had emerged from the aircraft and headed straight for the administration building. By mid-afternoon, campus rumor had escalated from a potential donor visit to theories about government investigations and even celebrity applications. Professor Richard Harrington cancelled his afternoon office hours, citing a pressing administrative matter. In truth, he needed time alone to process the seismic shift in his professional standing. For 2 decades, he had wielded considerable influence at Westridge, his academic pedigree and connections making him virtually untouchable in departmental politics. Now, in the span of a single meeting, he faced the prospect of public association with an admissions scandal that could permanently tarnish his reputation. In his office, he reread Abigail Hayes's application essays for the 3rd time, increasingly disturbed by what he recognized as exceptional writing that he had previously dismissed. Her literary analysis of rural poverty in Steinbeck, compared to contemporary Appalachian writers, showed sophistication he rarely saw in students from the most prestigious preparatory schools. How had he been so blind to her talent? The answer, he knew with growing discomfort, lay in the assumptions he had internalized throughout his own academic journey. Assumptions about where intelligence flourished and what backgrounds produced Westridge material. His phone buzzed with a text from Dean Wilson. Emergency faculty meeting called for 4 p.m., mandatory attendance. Meanwhile, at Fairfield County High School, Abigail Hayes was meeting with her guidance counselor, Ms. Reynolds, to discuss alternative and college options. "I still think Westridge made a mistake," Ms. Reynolds said, reviewing Abby's rejection letter with evident frustration. "Your qualifications are exceptional." "It's fine," Abby insisted, though her disappointment remained evident. "The community college has that guaranteed transfer program with State University. I can do 2 years there and then transfer for my junior and senior years." "But State doesn't have the literature program you wanted," Ms. Reynolds pointed out. "Have you considered appealing Westridge's decision, with recommendations from your AP teachers?" "No," Abby interrupted firmly. If they don't think I belong there, I'm not going to beg. Besides, she added with a half-smile, Dad says I've got too much Hayes pride for my own good. As they discussed other options, Abby's phone lit up with a notification. One of her few close friends had texted a link to a social media post from a Westridge student. Some rich lady just landed on campus in a helicopter and went straight to the president's office. Rumor is she's pissed about something and heads are gonna roll. Abby smiled at the drama of campus gossip, completely unaware of her connection to the unfolding situation. Sounds like an exciting day at Westridge, she commented, showing Miss Reynolds the post. Maybe some billionaire's kid didn't get in either. More likely a major donor making demands, Ms. Reynolds replied. That's how these elite schools work. Money talks. Then I definitely don't belong there, Abby said with quiet certainty. I'd rather earn my place somewhere than wonder if I only got in because of connections or donations. Across campus at Westridge Academy, the hastily assembled faculty meeting had created a buzz of speculation. When President Whitmore entered the room, accompanied by the entire senior administration team, the unusual gravity of the situation became apparent. Thank you all for coming on such short notice, Whitmore began, his normally affable expression replaced by serious determination. Today, Westridge Academy stands at a crossroads. This afternoon, we received a visit from Catherine Hayes Morgan, founder and CEO of Quantum Sphere Technologies. A murmur ran through the assembled faculty. Even those outside the technology fields recognized the name of the quantum encryption pioneer whose algorithms had revolutionized data security. Ms. Hayes Morgan has proposed establishing a Center for Computational Ethics at Westridge, fully endowed with an initial gift of $50 million. The murmur became audible gasps and exclamations. This would include new facilities, faculty, positions, research funds and scholarships, specifically targeting students from underrepresented backgrounds in technology fields. Whitmore continued. It represents the largest single donation in our institution's history. Faculty members exchanged excited glances. Such funding would elevate Westridge's profile tremendously, potentially raising its standing among liberal arts colleges nationally. However, Whitmore continued, his tone cooling the excitement, this gift comes with significant conditions regarding our admissions policies and practices. He outlined Catherine's proposal for admissions reform, including blind reviews, rebalanced evaluation, criteria and mandatory bias training. As he spoke, faculty reactions divided visibly, younger professors and those from diverse backgrounds nodding in agreement, while others, particularly those with long tenure, appeared skeptical or concerned. Why would Hayes Morgan take such interest in our admissions processes? Asked a mathematics professor. Quantum Sphere typically funds research at large technical universities, not liberal arts colleges. President Whitmore hesitated briefly before responding. Ms. Hayes Morgan's interest stems from a personal connection. Her daughter, Abigail Hayes, applied to Westridge this year and was rejected. All eyes in the room turned to Professor Harrington, whose role chairing the Humanities Admissions Committee was well known. Wait, said a young sociology professor, piecing together the information. Hayes, as in the farming family from Fairfield County? That application came through my Committee for Social Sciences consideration. The student had exceptional qualifications. Yes, Whitmore confirmed. As it happens, Catherine Hayes Morgan lives with her husband on a working farm in Fairfield County. She has maintained her privacy so successfully that her daughter apparently doesn't know about her mother's professional accomplishments. This revelation stunned the faculty into momentary silence as they processed the implications of having rejected the daughter of one of the wealthiest women in technology. To be clear, Whitmore continued deliberately, Ms. Hayes Morgan is not asking us to admit her daughter. In fact, she specifically requested that any reconsideration of Abigail's application be based solely on her merits, following the new protocols being established. Her primary concern is addressing what she identified as systemic bias in our admissions process. Professor Harrington, feeling the weight of collective attention, stood to address his colleagues. "I take full responsibility for the recommendation against Ms. Hayes' admission," he said, his academic pride warring with new self-awareness. "In reviewing her application, I made assumptions about her background that, upon reflection, were unfounded and inappropriate. This unprecedented admission from the usually uncompromising professor caused another ripple of surprise through the faculty. The proposed reforms," he continued with evident difficulty, "would help eliminate such biases from our process. And I have agreed to serve as faculty liaison to the implementation committee." While the faculty meeting continued at Westridge, Catherine's private jet was landing at a small regional airport near Fairfield County. She checked her watch. With luck, she would be home before Abby returned from her community college appointment. James had texted that he'd covered for her sudden absence with a story about agricultural equipment, but Catherine knew her thoughtful daughter might question such a vague explanation. As her driver took the familiar country roads toward the farm, Catherine reflected on the day's events. She had gone to Westridge prepared for battle, armed with data and leverage carefully assembled by her team. What she hadn't expected was the personal impact of speaking about Abby's rejection, the moment when her carefully constructed, professional demeanor had briefly cracked to reveal the mother beneath the CEO. For 15 years, she had maintained an extraordinary dual life, globally respected technology pioneer by profession, farmer's wife by local reputation. The separation had begun as a practical security measure when quantum spheres encryption algorithms became the gold standard for government and financial institutions worldwide. Catherine had received enough threats to recognize that anonymity offered the best protection for her family, but as the years passed, the separation had taken on new meaning. Raising Abby away from the distorting influence of extreme wealth had become increasingly important to both Catherine and James. They wanted their daughter to develop authentic relationships and a strong work ethic, uncomplicated by the knowledge that her mother's net worth exceeded the GDP of several small nations. Now, as Abby approached adulthood, Catherine wondered if they had made the right choice. Would learning the truth now feel like a betrayal to their daughter? Had they protected her or deceived her? Catherine's phone buzzed with a message from Marcus, her chief of staff. "Board members making calls as expected. Media starting to pick up rumors about major donation to Westridge. Need statement?" She responded quickly. "Standard philanthropic language. No mention of admissions reforms yet. No personal connection." The farm came into view, 180 acres of meticulously managed organic production that was contrary to Abby's belief. Not just modestly successful, but one of the most innovative agricultural operations in the Northeast. While Catherine managed her technology empire, James had built a genuinely thriving agricultural business, pioneering sustainable farming techniques that had become case studies at agricultural colleges. As the car pulled up to the farmhouse, Catherine spotted Abby's pickup already in the driveway. Her heart sank. She had hoped to arrive first and change into her farmer's wife clothes before her daughter returned. Inside, she found Abby and James at the kitchen table, both wearing expressions that told Catherine immediately that something had changed. On the table sat a printout of a business news article with the headline, "Quantum Sphere CEO makes surprise visit to Westridge Academy. Major donation rumored." Next to it lay a blurry photograph clearly taken by a student's phone, showing Catherine walking across the Westridge campus, her security team flanking her. "Mom," Abby said quietly, her voice a complex mixture of confusion, hurt, and awe. "Why didn't you tell me?" The carefully constructed wall between Catherine's two lives had finally cracked, and as she looked into her daughter's questioning eyes, she knew that everything was about to change. Not just for Westridge Academy, but for the family she had worked so hard to protect from the complications of her extraordinary success. What Catherine couldn't know, as she prepared to finally share her full identity with her daughter, was that Professor Harrington had already called an emergency meeting of the admissions committee to re-evaluate Abigail's application, not because of pressure from a powerful donor, but because the encounter had forced him to confront biases he hadn't recognized in himself until they were plainly exposed. And in Washington, D.C., an education policy advisor was preparing a briefing for the Secretary of Education about an intriguing development at Westridge Academy that might serve as a model for addressing socioeconomic bias in college admissions nationwide. The kitchen of the Hayes farmhouse had always been a place of warmth and honesty. Around the solid oak table, built by James's grandfather decades earlier, the family had shared meals, hopes, struggles, and accomplishments. Now that same table held printed articles and blurry photos that had shattered 15 years of careful secrecy. Catherine set down her briefcase, still wearing the elegant business attire that looked so out of place in their farmhouse kitchen. The silence stretched between mother and daughter, heavy with unasked questions. "How did you find out?" Catherine finally asked, her voice uncharacteristically uncertain. "One of the Westridge students posted photos of you on social media," Abby explained, her tone measured as she processed her conflicting emotions. "They were trying to figure out who the important visitor was. Someone identified you as Catherine Hayes Morgan of Quantum Sphere." She pushed her phone across the table, showing a Reddit thread where users had connected the helicopter landing with Catherine's rarely seen public image. "I didn't believe it at first. I thought it was just someone who looked like you. But then Dad came home early, and I could tell something was wrong." James, standing by the kitchen counter, nodded. "Marcus called to warn me the story was breaking. Online. I thought it was better she hear it from us than keep seeing it on social media." Catherine took a deep breath. "Abby, I know this is a shock, and you must have 1,000 questions." "Why?" Abby interrupted, the single word carrying the weight of years of unknowing. "Why would you hide something like this from me my entire life? Did you think I couldn't handle it? That I'd become some spoiled rich kid if I knew?" "It wasn't about not trusting you," Catherine said carefully. "When you were born, Quantum Sphere was just beginning to attract serious attention. My encryption algorithms were being adopted by governments and financial institutions worldwide, which made me a target for various threats. Keeping my family life separate from my professional identity was initially a security measure. But as you grew," James added, "we saw how children of extreme wealth often struggled with normal development, with knowing who to trust, with finding their own path rather than living in their parents' shadow. So you lied to me," Abby said flatly. "For 15 years, Catherine flinched at the word lied. "We omitted, we simplified. The farm is real. It's a successful business that your father has built with genuine innovation and hard work. I do manage the business operations just alongside my other responsibilities." "Other responsibilities," Abby repeated incredulously. "Like running a multi-billion-dollar technology company, having enough influence to land a helicopter at Westridge Academy and meet with the president?" Her voice caught. "Is that why you were there? Because of my rejection?" The directness of the question caught Catherine off guard. She had rehearsed many versions of this conversation over the years, but the reality of facing her daughter's hurt and confusion was far more difficult than she had imagined. "Yes," she admitted. "When I read Professor Harrington's rejection letter, I recognize something I've faced my entire career: judgment based on background rather than ability. The difference is that I had the power to challenge it while most students don't. So you used your money and influence to get me admitted after all, Abby concluded, disappointment clear in her voice. Everything I've worked for, everything I've earned, none of it matters because Mom can just buy my way in. No, Catherine said firmly, that's not what happened. I specifically told Westridge not to admit you based on my intervention. Any reconsideration of your application would happen only under new bias-mitigated protocols and based solely on your own merits. Abby looked skeptical. And they just agreed to that, without knowing you were planning to donate millions. Catherine exchanged a glance with James. It's more complicated than that. I presented evidence of systemic bias in their admissions process and proposed comprehensive reforms that would benefit thousands of students like you from rural and working-class backgrounds, not just my daughter. The donation, James explained gently, is for a new Center for Computational Ethics that would specifically recruit students from underrepresented backgrounds in technology. Your mother made it conditional on Westridge implementing the admissions. Reforms. Abby's expression shifted as she processed this information. So you used what happened to me to create change for others? The concept seemed to resonate with her sense of justice, even as she struggled with the revelations about her mother's identity. That was the goal, Catherine confirmed. Though I never intended for my identity to become public or for you to find out this way. She hesitated before adding, I always planned to tell you everything after graduation, once you'd established your own path. Abby stood abruptly and walked to the window, looking out at the farm that had shaped her identity. The fields, where she had learned responsibility caring for animals. The barn where she had written poetry during quiet evenings. The land that connected her to generations of Hayes family history. All of it was still real, still true to her experience. And yet everything had changed. I don't even know what to call you now, she said quietly, her back still turned. Are you Catherine Hayes or Catherine Hayes Morgan? I'm still your mother, Catherine answered, the simplicity of the response carrying more emotion than any elaborate explanation could. I have. Hayes Morgan is my professional name. Here with you and your father, I've always just been Catherine Hayes. Abby turned back, studying her mother with new eyes, seeing beyond the familiar figure who had packed her lunches and helped with homework to the powerful executive who had built a technological empire. All those business trips, she said, sudden, realizations clicking into place. The conferences about agricultural supply chains and organic certification. Some were legitimate farm business, James offered. But yes, others were cover for your mother's corporate responsibilities. And the satellite phone in your office, the extra security system, the consulting work you did on your computer, late at night. Each question revealed another puzzle piece shifting in Abby's understanding. Catherine nodded, acknowledging each accurate deduction. Running Quantum Sphere required certain accommodations, even here. Does anyone else know, Ms. Reynolds, the neighbors? Abby asked, trying to determine how isolated she had been in her ignorance. No one in Fairfield County knows, Catherine assured her. James and I have been extremely careful. Even at Quantum Sphere, only my most senior executives know about my family life. A thought suddenly struck Abby. Wait, am I actually Catherine Hayes Morgan's daughter on paper? Are there trust funds and stock portfolios I don't know about? Catherine smiled slightly at the practical question, so characteristic of her daughter's grounded approach to life. Yes, you are my legal heir, with appropriate trusts established for your future security. But we deliberately raised you without access to or awareness of that wealth. Because you thought I'd be spoiled, Abby concluded, a hint of resentment returning to her voice. Because we wanted you to develop your own identity and values, James corrected gently. To understand the satisfaction of earning something through your own efforts, to build relationships based on who you are, rather than what your family could provide. As Abby processed these explanations, her phone buzzed repeatedly with notifications. She glanced down to see a flood of messages from classmates and even teachers, all sharing links to emerging news stories about Catherine Hayes Morgan's visit to Westridge and speculating about the connection to Fairfield County. "I think our time for a private family discussion is running out," she said, holding up her phone. "My entire school is connecting the dots. By tomorrow, everyone will know." Catherine nodded grimly. "We need to decide how to handle this publicly. The story is moving faster than I anticipated." "We?" Abby asked, arching an eyebrow in a gesture remarkably similar to her mother's. "Do I finally get a say in my own life story?" The question hung in the air, layered with 15 years of decisions made on Abby's behalf without her knowledge or consent. "Yes," Catherine said firmly. "From this point forward, you decide how much or how little you want to be associated with Catherine Hayes Morgan and Quantum Sphere. If you want to continue living as Abigail Hayes, farmer's daughter and writer, we'll find a way to make that happen as much as possible." The offer of agency seemed to ease some of Abby's tension. "I need time to think," she said finally. "This is a lot." As the family continued their difficult conversation, events were unfolding rapidly at Westridge Academy. The admissions committee had reconvened for an emergency session, with Professor Harrington presenting a strikingly different analysis of Abigail Hayes's application than he had offered weeks earlier. "When we evaluate the quality of analytical thinking demonstrated in these essays," he explained, pointing to specific passages previously overlooked, "we see exceptional intellectual maturity. Ms. Hayes's writing on rural literary traditions shows a sophisticated understanding of class dynamics in American fiction that many of our current students could learn from." Professor Chen, who had initially supported Abigail's application, watched this transformation with cautious optimism. "Are we certain this reassessment isn't influenced by our awareness of her mother's identity and the proposed donation?" "A fair concern," Harrington acknowledged with unexpected humility, "which is why I've applied the blind review protocols proposed in Ms. Hayes Morgan's reforms. I've had 5 colleagues from different departments evaluate the application with all socioeconomic indicators removed. Their assessments were unanimously positive." Dean Wilson, overseeing the process, nodded approvingly. "The question becomes, do we move forward with an admission offer now, knowing it might appear to be a response to external pressure, or wait until the reforms are fully implemented next cycle? If we're confident in our assessment that she meets or exceeds our standards," Professor Chen argued, "delaying an offer solely due to optics would perpetuate the injustice. She deserves to be evaluated fairly on her merits, which apparently didn't happen the first time." As the committee debated, President Whitmore was in his office fielding calls from board members, media outlets, and even representatives from other educational institutions interested in the reforms being proposed. What had begun as a confrontation over a single student's rejection was rapidly evolving into a potential model for addressing systemic bias in elite college admissions. Nationwide, meanwhile, the story was spreading across social media and news platforms. A technology billionaire confronting an elite college over class bias in admissions made for compelling headlines, particularly when combined with the human interest angle of a mother who had concealed her identity from her own daughter to give her a normal upbringing. Back at the farmhouse as evening fell, Abby found herself alone in the hayloft of the barn, her personal retreat since childhood. With the family's secret now exposed, she tried to reconcile the mother she had always known with the powerful figure depicted in the business articles she had spent the afternoon reading. The Catherine Hayes Morgan, described in Forbes and Bloomberg, was a ruthless negotiator, a mathematical genius, and a notoriously private individual who had revolutionized data security. Yet she was also the woman who had taught Abby to ride a bike, who had cried at her poetry recitals and who made terrible pancakes every Sunday morning. Both versions were true. Both were her mother. As she wrestled with these competing truths, Abby's phone lit up with a new email notification from an address she immediately recognized: Admissions, Westridge to EDU. The subject line read simply, "Update regarding your application to Westridge Academy." With trembling fingers, she opened the message, uncertain whether to hope for acceptance or fear it as the result of her mother's influence rather than her own merits. The opening line would determine not just her educational future, but her understanding of fairness in a world she now realized was far more complex than she had ever imagined. What Abby couldn't know as she stared at her phone screen was that the admissions committee's decision had been reached through a process of honest self-examination triggered by her mother's intervention, a process that would soon be formalized into admissions policies affecting thousands of applicants across the country. And in Washington, D.C., the Secretary of Education had just scheduled a press conference to announce a new initiative examining socioeconomic bias in college admissions, inspired by the reforms being implemented at a small but prestigious liberal arts college called Westridge Academy. In the quiet of the barn loft, illuminated only by the glow of her phone screen, Abigail Hayes read the email from Westridge Academy with growing disbelief. "Dear Ms. Hayes, following a comprehensive reassessment of your application materials under our newly implemented review protocols, the admissions committee has determined that our previous decision failed to properly evaluate the exceptional quality of your academic work and unique perspective. Westridge Academy would like to offer you admission to our incoming class with a full academic scholarship in recognition of your outstanding achievements. This offer represents our genuine assessment of your qualifications and potential contribution to our community. We understand that recent events may have created complicated feelings regarding our institution. Should you wish to discuss this offer or the circumstances surrounding your application, Dean Margaret Wilson would be available for a personal conversation at your convenience. Sincerely, the Admissions Committee, Westridge Academy." Abby read the message 3 times, trying to discern whether this represented a genuine reassessment or merely damage control in the wake of her mother's intervention. The mention of newly implemented review protocols suggested actual systemic changes rather than a simple reversal, but doubt lingered. She climbed down from the loft and walked slowly back to the farmhouse, where her parents were sitting at the kitchen table, their conversation halting when she entered. "Westridge just emailed me," she announced, holding up her phone. "They've reversed their decision, full academic scholarship." Catherine's expression remained carefully neutral. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking," Abby replied slowly, "that I'm not sure if I earned this or if it's because my mother is Catherine Hayes Morgan." "What does the email say?" James asked. "Exactly." Abby handed him her phone. After reading it, he passed it to Catherine, who studied it carefully before looking up at her daughter. "They implemented the blind review protocols," she said. "Your application was reassessed without any socioeconomic indicators. Essentially, without revealing you're a farmer's daughter from Fairfield County, or that I'm your daughter," Abby pointed out. "The admissions committee members would know that connection now," Catherine acknowledged. "But the protocols require multiple independent reviewers, including faculty who weren't on the original committee." Abby sat down, considering this information. "So it's possible this is legitimate, that they actually looked at my work this time instead of my background." "More than possible," James assured her. "Remember, Professor Chen originally advocated for your admission based on your writing. The system was biased, but not everyone in it." As Abby contemplated her options, Catherine's secure phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and frowned. "I need to take this," she said, stepping into her office. When she returned several minutes later, her expression was grave. "That was Marcus. The story has gone viral. It's being picked up by national news outlets. They're calling it the farmer's daughter scandal and framing it as an exposé of class bias in elite college admissions." She placed her tablet on the table, showing headlines from major publications. "Tech billionaire goes undercover as farmer's wife exposes elite college bias. The rejection that sparked a revolution. How one student's experience revealed systemic problems in college admissions. Quantum sphere. CEO's daughter rejected by elite college for being too rural." Abby scrolled through the articles with growing horror. "They're making me sound like some kind of victim, and you like some crusading avenger. They don't even know me." "Welcome to public life," Catherine said grimly. "Once a story catches fire, the narrative takes on a life of its own. This is exactly what I've worked to protect you from all these years." "What do we do now?" Abby asked, looking between her parents. "We have options," Catherine replied, shifting into the strategic thinking that had built her company. "We can issue a statement clarifying certain facts. We can give a controlled interview to shape the narrative. Or we can maintain privacy and let the story burn itself out, though that seems increasingly unlikely given the education policy angles emerging." James placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder. "But the most important decision is yours, Abby. Do you want to accept Westridge's offer?" The question hung in the air as Abby weighed considerations that had become infinitely more complex than simple college choice. Attending Westridge now meant stepping into a spotlight she had never sought, becoming part of a narrative that had already escaped her control. "I need to speak with someone at Westridge directly," she decided finally. "The email mentioned Dean Wilson. I want to hear from her exactly how this reassessment happened." Catherine nodded approvingly at her daughter's measured approach. A wise next step. The following morning, Abby found herself in an unprecedented situation, sitting in the family's rarely used formal living room, speaking via video call to Dean Margaret Wilson of Westridge Academy. Catherine and James had respectfully given her privacy for the conversation after helping set up the call. "Ms. Hayes, thank you for taking the time to speak with me," Dean Wilson began, her manner professional but warm. "I imagine the past few days have been overwhelming." "That's an understatement," Abby replied with unexpected poise. "I'd appreciate your candor about what exactly happened with my application." Dean Wilson nodded, seemingly appreciating the direct approach. "Your application was initially rejected primarily due to concerns raised by Professor Harrington about cultural fit. Concerns that, in retrospect, reflected problematic assumptions about students from rural backgrounds." She continued, with remarkable frankness. "Following your mother's intervention and the evidence she presented of systemic bias in our process, we implemented immediate reforms for reassessment. 5 faculty members who were not on the original committee reviewed your application with all socioeconomic indicators removed. All 5 recommended admission, citing exceptional analytical skills and unique perspective." "And the scholarship?" Abby asked. "Based entirely on merit," Dean Wilson assured her. "Your academic credentials place you in the top 2% of our applicant pool. The scholarship would have been offered in the initial round had your application received appropriate consideration." Abby absorbed this information, searching for any hint of placation or damage control in the dean's manner, but finding none. "And if I were to attend Westridge, would I be seen as the student who got in because her billionaire mother intervened? Or the rural student who needed special consideration?" Dean Wilson's expression softened slightly. "I won't pretend there wouldn't be challenges. Your situation has attracted attention, but I can tell you that the faculty who reviewed your writing are genuinely excited about your potential contribution to our academic community." After nearly an hour of candid conversation that addressed everything from campus climate to the implementation timeline for admissions reforms, Abby ended the call with much to consider. Meanwhile, Catherine had reluctantly agreed to a limited press statement through Quantum Sphere's communications team, confirming her identity as Abigail Hayes's mother, while emphasizing that her efforts at Westridge were focused on systemic reform rather than individual intervention. By midday, the story had evolved further, with education policy experts weighing in on the implications for college admissions nationwide. The Secretary of Education had issued a statement announcing a comprehensive review of socio-economic bias in selective college admissions, explicitly citing the Westridge situation as a catalyst. At Westridge Academy, Professor Richard Harrington sat in his office surrounded by stacks of admissions files he had begun methodically re-evaluating using the new protocols. The professional humiliation he had anticipated had taken an unexpected turn. President Whitmore had publicly framed Harrington's role in the admissions reforms as a commitment to academic integrity and willingness to evolve. Rather than facing censure, he was being positioned as part of the solution, provided he fully embraced the reform process and his role in implementing it. It was a masterful piece of institutional politics that simultaneously protected Westridge's reputation while ensuring Harrington's compliance with the new direction. As he reviewed applications previously rejected for nebulous fit concerns, Harrington found himself confronting biases he had never acknowledged, subtle preferences for students from familiar backgrounds, assumptions about intellectual potential based on zip codes and family occupations, dismissal of accomplishments achieved without prestigious institutional support. The experience was professionally humbling, but personally transformative, forcing him to reconsider fundamental assumptions that had guided his academic career. The elegant philosophical framework he had constructed to justify Westridge's exclusivity was revealing itself as little more than sophisticated rationalization for class bias. That evening, the Hayes family gathered again around their kitchen table, the place where truths had always been shared, now more complex but no less important. "I've decided to accept Westridge's offer," Abby announced, her expression resolute. "Not because it's prestigious or because the story surrounding my admission has drawn attention, but because it's the right academic environment for what I want. To study." Catherine studied her daughter with quiet pride. "You're certain?" "I spoke at length with Dean Wilson and 2 professors in the literature department," Abby explained. "The interdisciplinary program they're developing between American literature and social justice advocacy aligns perfectly with my interests." And she added with a hint of her mother's strategic thinking, "I would have the opportunity to participate in shaping the admissions reforms from a student perspective." "You'd be stepping into public visibility," James cautioned gently. "Once you enroll, the connection between Catherine Hayes Morgan and Abigail Hayes becomes official. There's no going back to anonymity." "I know," Abby acknowledged, "but maybe that's not entirely negative. The narrative right now is about privilege and bias, but it could be about something more constructive, about using unexpected platforms to create meaningful change." Catherine recognized in her daughter's words echoes of her own thinking decades earlier when she had faced the choice between comfortable academic success and the riskier path of founding Quantum Sphere. "You sound like you've given this considerable thought." "I have," Abby confirmed, "and I've realized something important. You and Dad raised me to value authenticity and to stand by my principles. For years, you've used your influence at Quantum Sphere to advocate for ethical technology development. Maybe it's time for me to find my own voice, not as Catherine Hayes Morgan's daughter, but as Abigail Hayes, who happens to have access to platforms most rural students never see." The maturity in this assessment left both parents momentarily speechless. The crisis that had threatened to fracture their family was instead revealing deeper strengths and shared values that transcended the deception behind it. "There's something else," Abby continued, a hint of mischief entering her expression for the first time since the revelations began. "I've decided what I'm going to write about for my first major paper at Westridge." "What's that?" James asked. "Invisible power, the ethics of hidden influence in American society," Abby replied with a meaningful glance at her mother. "I think I have some unique insights on the subject." Catherine laughed, a genuine relieved sound that broke the remaining tension in the room. "I believe Professor Harrington will find that perspective enlightening." 1 week later, the Westridge Academy campus buzzed with activity as students returned from spring break. Conversations dominated by the admissions scandal and subsequent reforms that had thrust their small liberal arts college into the national spotlight. Professor Harrington's Contemporary American Literature seminar was filled beyond capacity, with students crowding in to witness the faculty member at the center of the controversy. As he began outlining the semester's remaining curriculum, a knock at the classroom door momentarily interrupted his lecture. The room fell silent as Abigail Hayes entered, her simple, confident presence immediately drawing all eyes. The story of her rejection and her mother's dramatic intervention had made her something of a campus legend before she even arrived. "Ms. Hayes," Harrington acknowledged, his tone carefully professional despite the extraordinary circumstances of her admission. "Welcome to Westridge Academy. We were just discussing changing perspectives in contemporary rural literature, a subject I believe you've studied extensively." "Yes, Professor Harrington," Abby replied with composed dignity that impressed even the most skeptical observers. "I found that authentic voices often emerge from unexpected places if we're willing to truly listen." The subtle challenge in her response wasn't lost on the professor or the attentive students. As Abby took her seat, Harrington recognized that the true education of the semester might not be what he taught his students, but what this remarkable young woman, underestimated because of her background but ultimately impossible to ignore, would teach them all about assumptions, authenticity, and the courage to stand for systemic change rather than individual exception. 4 years later, the sprawling great lawn of Westridge Academy bloomed with rows of white chairs and festive decorations for Commencement Day. Families gathered under a perfect blue sky to celebrate the graduating class, many arriving hours early to secure prime viewing positions for the ceremony that had taken on special significance this year. Among them, James Hayes stood adjusting his rarely worn tie, while Catherine, now publicly acknowledged as Catherine Hayes Morgan, spoke quietly with several board members whose children were also graduating. The path from secrecy to selective public engagement had been carefully navigated over 4 years, with Catherine maintaining her essential privacy while no longer hiding her identity or accomplishments. "Hard to believe it's been 4 years already," James remarked as his wife rejoined him, taking his hand with the easy familiarity of their decades together. "Seems like yesterday we were helping Abby move into her dormitory, wondering if we'd made the right decision." "Indeed," Catherine agreed, surveying the campus that had become so familiar. The newly constructed Hayes Morgan Center for Computational Ethics stood prominently at the north end of campus, its modern architecture integrated thoughtfully with Westridge's historical aesthetic. Though I'd say they've been rather consequential years. This was an understatement that both recognized with knowing smiles. What had begun with a helicopter landing and a confrontation in the president's office had evolved into a transformation extending far beyond. Westridge Academy, The admissions reforms pioneered at Westridge had been featured in the Chronicle of Higher Education, studied by the Department of Education, and subsequently adopted by dozens of elite institutions across the country. The Westridge Protocol, as it became known in academic circles, had become a standard for mitigating socio-economic bias in selective college admissions. President Whitmore, approaching retirement after nearly 25 years leading Westridge, had leveraged the initial controversy into a signature achievement. His leadership in implementing and championing the reforms had transformed a potential scandal into a model for institutional evolution, earning Westridge recognition as a pioneer in educational equity. "Look who's arrived," James nudged Catherine gently, nodding toward the academic procession forming near the administration building. Professor Richard Harrington walked alongside his colleagues, resplendent in full academic regalia that contrasted with his now more humble demeanor. The transformation in the once arrogant professor had been perhaps the most unexpected development of the past 4 years. After initial resistance, he had embraced his role on the Admissions Reform Committee with growing conviction, eventually becoming one of its most passionate advocates. His published paper, analyzing the implicit bias patterns revealed in admissions data, had become required reading in higher education administration programs nationwide. What had begun as professional embarrassment had ultimately revitalized his academic career in directions he could never have anticipated. Dr. Chen mentioned he's been offered a distinguished chair at Princeton, Catherine noted, specifically to continue his work on class bias in higher education. "Quite the evolution from the man who rejected our daughter for being a farm girl," James chuckled. "Life does have its ironies." As the ceremony's beginning approached, Catherine checked her watch with a hint of concern. "Abby should be here. By now, the student speakers need to line up early." James squeezed her hand reassuringly. "She'll be here. You know how she is, always making time for one more conversation that matters." Indeed, at that moment, Abigail Hayes was in the university library atrium, speaking with a prospective student and her parents who had traveled from rural Appalachia to visit Westridge. As the founding president of the first-generation student alliance, Abby had made such encounters a priority throughout her years at Westridge. "The most important thing to understand," she was explaining to the nervous-looking high school junior, "is that your perspective is exactly what enriches classroom discussions here. The questions you ask from your unique background often reveal assumptions the rest of us don't even recognize we're making." The girl's parents, a coal miner and a postal worker, exchanged hopeful glances as their daughter visibly relaxed, listening to this poised senior in graduation regalia who spoke with such conviction. "But won't I feel out of place?" the girl asked, the worry that had likely kept her awake at night finally voiced. "Most students here come from professional families, prep schools." "Some do," Abby acknowledged with a smile. "And 4 years ago, I asked the exact same question. My dad's a farmer, and I went to a rural public high school where our AP classes had 12 students on a good day." She gestured toward the window where the commencement setup was visible across the great lawn. "Today, I'm giving the student commencement address, and I promise you it's not because of family connections or special treatment. It's because Westridge actually does what it claims to do now. Values diverse perspectives and recognizes that excellence comes in many forms." What Abby didn't add was how hard-won that institutional change had been, or her own role in ensuring the reforms remained robust rather than cosmetic. Throughout her 4 years, she had strategically balanced her emerging public identity as Catherine Hayes Morgan's daughter with her own distinctive voice and priorities. Her journey at Westridge had not been without challenges. The initial media frenzy surrounding her admission had created a spotlight she never wanted. Some students had initially assumed she received special treatment, while others had expected her to leverage her mother's wealth and connections for social advantage. Navigating these expectations while establishing her own identity had required courage and steadfast commitment to her values. Abby's freshman literature class with Professor Harrington had become something of a campus legend. She had neither sought confrontation nor avoided difficult conversations, earning respect through the quality of her work and her willingness to engage constructively with the professor who had initially rejected her application. By her senior year, she had taken 3 of Harrington's advanced seminars, challenging his perspectives while acknowledging his genuine expertise. After sharing contact information with the prospective student and promising to connect her with the Rural Student Network, Abby hurried across campus toward the commencement staging area, her graduation gown billowing behind her. As she passed the Humanities building, Professor Harrington emerged, also in full academic regalia. "Cutting it rather close, Miss Hayes," he remarked with the dry humor that had gradually replaced his former condescension. "Last-minute recruitment for the cause, Professor," she replied with a smile. "A promising young writer from coal country who needs to understand she belongs here." Harrington nodded, understanding the reference without elaboration. Their relationship had evolved from the tension of that first classroom encounter to a complex mutual respect built through 4 years of intellectual engagement. "Your speech today," he said as they walked together toward the ceremony, "I expect it will be as thought-provoking as your thesis." "I hope so," Abby replied, though perhaps slightly less controversial. Her senior thesis, Class Barriers in American Higher Education, Personal Narrative as Institutional Critique, had caused considerable stir when published in a prestigious education journal, its unflinching examination of her own experience serving as a lens for systemic analysis. "A pity," Harrington said with unexpected humor. "Controversy seems to suit you rather well, Ms. Hayes." "I prefer to think of it as productive discomfort," she countered, "and I learned from the best." This acknowledgement of her mother's influence, the woman who had leveraged a single rejection letter into nationwide educational reform, brought a rare smile to Harrington's face. "Indeed you did, though your application of those lessons has been entirely your own." They parted at the staging area, where Abby joined her fellow student speakers, while Harrington took his place in the faculty procession. Minutes later, as pomp and circumstance filled the air, the commencement ceremony began. The processional included not just Westridge faculty and graduates, but distinguished visitors that reflected the national impact of the admissions reforms that had begun here. The Secretary of Education sat on the platform alongside representatives from several major universities that had implemented versions of the Westridge Protocol. Educational journalists from major publications discreetly took notes, recognizing the symbolic importance of this particular graduating class. President Whitmore's welcome address acknowledged the unique journey of these students. "You entered Westridge during a period of institutional transformation and participated actively in reshaping our community. The changes you've witnessed and helped implement will benefit generations of students to come," he continued with particular emphasis. "This class includes the highest percentage of first-generation college students and rural students in Westridge's 175-year history. Far from diminishing our academic standing, this diversity of perspective has enhanced it, evidenced by unprecedented achievements in national academic competitions, publication rates, and graduate school placements." When the time came for the student address, Abby approached the podium with confident steps that betrayed none of the nervousness she felt facing the assembled crowd. She spotted her parents in the audience, her father beaming openly, her mother's pride evident in her subtle smile and direct gaze. "4 years ago," Abby began, her voice clear and measured, "I received a rejection letter from Westridge Academy. That letter suggested my rural background failed to prepare me for the unique social and cultural environment of this institution. Murmur ran through the audience. While the story had been well publicized, hearing it addressed so directly at commencement created a moment of tension. That rejection became the catalyst for institutional changes that have made Westridge a leader in educational equity, Abby continued. And those changes created the opportunity for me and many others to demonstrate that excellence and insight come from unexpected places, from family farms and factory towns, from inner cities and indigenous communities. She paused, looking out at her classmates. Our class includes the children of CEOs and senators, yes, but also the children of factory workers, teachers, farmers, and first-generation immigrants. This diversity hasn't diluted Westridge's academic excellence. It has enhanced it by bringing together perspectives that challenge assumptions and expand understanding. As her address continued, weaving personal narrative with institutional history and broader educational philosophy, Catherine watched her daughter with complex emotions. The speech displayed Abby's distinctive voice and vision while echoing Catherine's own commitment to systemic rather than individual solutions. The true measure of an institution, Abby concluded, is not its selectivity or prestige, but its willingness to evolve when confronted with its own limitations. And the true measure of an education is not the credential it provides, but the perspectives it transforms. By both measures, I stand before you deeply grateful for my Westridge education, an opportunity that began with rejection, but culminated in something far more valuable than simple acceptance. The applause that followed was led by an unexpected source, Professor Richard Harrington, rising to his feet with genuine appreciation for a student who had challenged him to become a better educator and a more thoughtful human being. After the ceremony, the great lawn transformed into a reception area where graduates and families mingled. The Hayes-Morgan family found themselves at the center of considerable attention, though Catherine maintained the measured approachability she had cultivated since her identity became public. Dean Margaret Wilson approached, offering warm congratulations to Abby. "Your impact on Westridge will continue long after today," she said sincerely. The First Generation Student Alliance, the Rural Education Initiative, your work on the admissions committee, you've built structures that will support students for years to come. "Just trying to ensure the door stays open behind me," Abby replied. "Institutional memory can be surprisingly short without embedded practices. This pragmatic understanding of how reforms persist or don't reflected lessons learned during her 4 years. The initial media attention to Westridge's admissions overhaul had eventually faded, and Abby had witnessed firsthand how easily progress could erode without consistent advocacy and structural safeguards. Her solution had been characteristically practical, creating student organizations with faculty partnerships, developing mentorship programs that connected rural and first-generation students across class years, and documenting the positive outcomes of diversity in academic achievement to provide data-driven support for continuing the reforms. As the reception continued, Catherine found herself face-to-face with Harrington for the first time since their initial confrontation 4 years earlier. "Professor Harrington," she acknowledged with a polite nod. "Ms. Hayes-Morgan," he replied with equal formality. "Your daughter's address was exceptional, though I suspect you're well aware of that." "Abby has always had her own voice," Catherine said. "We just had to ensure she had the platform to use it." The subtle reference to their first meeting, where Catherine had used her considerable power to create institutional change, was not lost on Harrington. "I've been meaning to thank you," he said unexpectedly, lowering his voice slightly to ensure privacy in the crowded reception. 4 years ago, you could have simply demanded your daughter's admission or made a donation conditional on reversing a single decision. Instead, you insisted on addressing the underlying problem. It wasn't entirely altruistic, Catherine admitted. I wanted Abby to attend an institution that genuinely valued her perspective, not one that merely tolerated her presence because of my influence. Harrington nodded thoughtfully. You succeeded. Beyond what I believe either of us could have imagined, the Westridge Protocol is being implemented at universities nationwide. The recent federal guidelines on admissions equity drew heavily from our model, and your own work on implicit bias in academic evaluation has been equally influential, Catherine acknowledged, recognizing the genuine evolution in the man who had once dismissed her daughter as inherently unsuitable for Westridge. Their conversation was interrupted as the Secretary of Education approached, accompanied by President Whitmore. The media presence at the ceremony had increased subtly but noticeably as the Secretary's staff prepared for what was apparently a planned announcement. Ms. Hayes Morgan, the Secretary greeted Catherine warmly. I hope you don't mind, but we've scheduled a brief press conference. The department is announcing a new initiative based substantially on the work pioneered here at Westridge, and we'd be honored if you and your daughter would join us. Catherine glanced toward Abby, who was deep in conversation with several classmates across the lawn. I believe this should be my daughter's decision. This is her graduation day, after all. When approached about the press conference, Abby considered carefully before agreeing. As long as it's clear that this isn't about one student or one institution, but about systemic change that benefits thousands of students nationwide. The impromptu press conference took place near the Hayes Morgan Center, where the Secretary of Education announced the creation of a national commission on socio-economic equity in higher education admissions. The commission would develop guidelines and best practices based on evidence gathered from institutions that had implemented reforms similar to the Westridge Protocol. We've seen compelling data from Westridge and other participating institutions, the Secretary explained to the assembled journalists. When admissions processes are redesigned to mitigate bias, we discover extraordinary talent that traditional metrics often miss. This initiative aims to help institutions nationwide benefit from these insights. When asked about her role in sparking these changes, Abby responded with characteristic thoughtfulness. The circumstances that brought attention to these issues were unique to my situation, but the underlying problems affect countless students. What matters isn't how the conversation started, but that it's continuing and expanding in ways that create lasting, meaningful change. As the official events concluded and families began departing campus, the Hayes Morgan family found a quiet moment together in the peaceful gardens behind the Humanities building, a space that had become one of Abby's favorite study locations during her time at Westridge. So, James asked his daughter with a gentle smile, was it worth it? All the scrutiny, the pressure, the public attention you never wanted? Abby considered the question seriously. There were definitely times I wished I could just be an ordinary student. But then I'd meet someone like Emma from Appalachia today, brilliant, deserving, but questioning whether she belongs in these spaces. And I'd remember why all of this matters. Catherine observed her daughter with quiet pride. The farm girl, who had once received a rejection letter questioning her cultural fit, had graduated summa cum laude, published academic work as an undergraduate, and helped transform institutional practices while maintaining her authentic self throughout. What happens next? Catherine asked, genuinely curious about her daughter's plans. Despite their closer relationship over the past 4 years, Abby had maintained a strong sense of independence, including turning down Catherine's offer to join Quantum Sphere's Ethical Advisory Board until she had established her own professional identity. I've accepted the fellowship at Georgetown Law's Center for Education Equity, Abby replied. Their work on legal frameworks for institutional reform aligns perfectly with what I want to pursue. She smiled at her mother. And before you ask, yes, I applied under my legal name, Hayes Morgan, but requested that my application be evaluated without reference to my relationship to the Hayes Morgan Center or Foundation. Old habits die hard. Some principles are worth maintaining, Catherine agreed approvingly. As they prepared to leave campus, Abby paused to look back at Westridge, the institution that had rejected her and then, through extraordinary circumstances, become the platform for both her individual growth and systemic change. "You know what's ironic," she observed. "Professor Harrington was actually right about one thing in that rejection letter. He said Westridge sought students whose background and experiences prepare them for the unique social and cultural environment of our campus." "Community? Not seeing the irony yet," James commented. "My background as a farmer's daughter who learned persistence through failed crops and harsh seasons, who developed critical thinking through practical problem solving, who understood community interdependence through rural life. That background prepared me perfectly for navigating institutional change," Abby explained. "Just not in the way he meant." Catherine laughed appreciatively at her daughter's insight. "The best revolutions often come from those the system underestimates." Later that evening, as the family celebrated privately at a restaurant in town, Catherine received a message from Marcus, her chief of staff at Quantum Sphere. The company's educational technology division had developed an algorithm to help identify bias patterns in admissions data. Technology now being adopted by universities nationwide as part of implementing the Westridge Protocol. Implementation. "Agreement signed with 15 more universities today," the message read. "Educational division projecting 40% growth this quarter. Board extremely pleased with the ethical technology leadership position." Catherine showed the message to Abby with a small smile. "It seems your rejection letter has been good for business too." "Ethical profit from ethical solutions," Abby acknowledged. "I can live with that version of capitalism." As their celebration continued, a young server approached their table somewhat hesitantly. "Excuse me," she said, addressing Abby. "I hope this isn't inappropriate, but I start at Westridge this fall. I'm from a small town in Idaho, and I'm the first in my family to go to college. Your story is kind of what made me think I could apply." Abby's expression warmed immediately. "What's your name?" "Melissa," the young woman replied. "Well, Melissa from Idaho, you absolutely belong at Westridge," Abby assured her. "And when you get there, look up the First Generation Student Alliance. Tell them I sent you." After the young woman left, visibly encouraged by the interaction, James raised his glass in a toast. "To doors opened and paths cleared," he said simply, "and to those who walk through them on their own merit," Catherine added meaningfully. Abby completed the toast with her own perspective. "To systems changed, rather than exceptions made." The following morning, as the Hayes Morgan family prepared to depart Westridge for the last time as a student's family, they visited the newly established wall in the admissions office displaying the Westridge Protocol, the formalized set of principles and practices that had emerged from Catherine's original confrontation 4 years earlier. The framed document began with a simple but powerful statement. Westridge Academy recognizes that excellence takes many forms and emerges from diverse backgrounds. Our admissions process is designed to identify and welcome extraordinary potential, regardless of socio-economic circumstance. Below it hung a small plaque acknowledging the catalyst for this institutional transformation. Established 2022, following the Hayes Morgan Initiative for Educational Equity. What had begun with a rejection letter stating that a farmer's daughter wouldn't fit the cultural environment of an elite institution had culminated in a fundamental reimagining of what that environment should be, not a homogeneous enclave, requiring conformity to established patterns of privilege, but a dynamic community enriched by diverse perspectives and experiences. As Catherine stood beside her daughter, reading the principles they had helped establish, she reflected that some inheritances can't be measured in monetary terms. The legacy that truly mattered wasn't the wealth or influence she would eventually pass to Abby, but the principles that had already taken root, the commitment to challenging unjust systems rather than simply navigating them successfully as an individual. In the end, the most valuable education hadn't happened in Westridge's classrooms, but in the real-world lesson that began with a rejection letter and culminated in institutional change. A lesson about how power, when wielded thoughtfully, can create openings not just for one person, but for countless others whose voices might otherwise remain unheard. Professor Harrington, observing the family from his office window overlooking the admissions building, reflected on his own journey from gatekeeper to advocate. The academic who had once dismissed a student based on her rural background had become a leading voice for educational equity, a transformation as profound as any in his 4 decades of teaching. He turned back to his desk, where a framed copy of Abigail Hayes's first essay for his American literature seminar held a place of honor. He had given it an A, with a comment that now seemed prescient. Your perspective challenges conventional interpretations in ways that expand our understanding. Westridge will be better for your presence. The rural student he had deemed unsuitable for Westridge's cultural environment had in fact transformed that environment for the better, proving that excellence and insight often come from the very backgrounds that traditional systems undervalue. And somewhere in rural America, a young person with extraordinary potential was receiving an admissions letter from a prestigious institution that had learned to see beyond zip codes and family occupations to recognize the unique value of diverse perspectives. All because a farmer's daughter had received a rejection letter, and her mother had arrived on campus in a helicopter to change the system, rather than simply reverse a decision. Some rejections, it seemed, could ultimately open doors far wider than any simple acceptance ever could. The autumn rain fell softly on the Georgetown campus as Abigail Hayes Morgan hurried toward the law center, clutching her lecture notes while balancing a coffee cup. At 27, she had completed her law degree with highest honors and accepted a prestigious faculty fellowship in educational policy law, focusing on institutional barriers to educational access. Today marked a special occasion, her first public lecture in the Distinguished Speaker Series, addressing an audience that would include law students, faculty, policy makers, and even a contingent from Westridge Academy. Inside the auditorium, Catherine and James had already arrived, taking seats toward the back at Abby's insistence that she not see their faces while trying to maintain professional composure. James wore a suit, still a rarity for him, while Catherine had adopted the refined but understated style that had become her signature since stepping into a more public role. Professor Harrington just arrived, James noted, gesturing subtly toward the entrance where the now-retired professor was greeting several colleagues from Westridge. I'm glad he could make it, Catherine replied. His recommendation helped secure Abby's fellowship position, despite his insistence that she didn't need his help. The past 5 years had seen remarkable developments in the aftermath of what education circles now called the Westridge Reformation. The admissions protocols that began with Catherine's confrontation had evolved into a comprehensive framework, adopted by over 70 institutions nationwide, with measurable impacts on student diversity and academic outcomes. More surprisingly, Professor Harrington had become one of the reform movement's most compelling advocates. After his mandatory retirement from Westridge at age 70, he had embarked on a lecture tour, sharing his own transformation from gatekeeper to gateway builder, as he described it. His book, Class Dismissed: Confronting Bias in Academic Evaluation, had become required reading in education administration programs. The auditorium filled quickly, with a notable contingent of students wearing Rural Education Alliance pins, an organization that had grown from Abbey's campus initiative to a national advocacy group with chapters at 30 universities. Dean Margaret Wilson entered with President Whitmore's successor, Dr. Elaine Rodriguez, the first woman and first person of color to lead Westridge Academy. Their presence represented the institutional commitment to the reforms that had reshaped Westridge's identity and elevated its standing in higher education. At precisely 3 p.m., the Georgetown Law Dean approached the podium to introduce the speaker. Our distinguished speaker today represents a unique intersection of personal experience and professional expertise in educational equity law. After graduating summa cum laude from Westridge Academy and completing her JD here at Georgetown, she has already distinguished herself through her groundbreaking work on legal frameworks for institutional reform. Please welcome Abigail Hayes Morgan. Abby approached the podium with the quiet confidence that had become her hallmark. Her presentation, titled Beyond Access, Legal Frameworks for Authentic Inclusion in Higher Education, drew on both data-driven research and personal narrative to illustrate how institutional structures could either reinforce or dismantle barriers to educational equity. "The question isn't simply who gets in," she explained, displaying a slide showing dramatic changes in student demographics at participating institutions, "but whether our educational environments allow diverse students to thrive once admitted. Access without inclusion merely creates revolving doors rather than open pathways." From their seats, Catherine and James exchanged proud glances as their daughter masterfully wove complex legal concepts with accessible examples that resonated with the diverse audience. The farm girl whose rejection letter had sparked a movement now commanded the attention of educational policy leaders with authority and insight. Following the formal lecture, attendees gathered for a reception where Abby found herself surrounded by students eager to discuss their own experiences with institutional barriers. She made time for each conversation, particularly with first-generation and rural students who saw in her a model for navigating elite spaces without surrendering authentic identity. Across the room, Catherine was engaged in conversation with several foundation directors interested in expanding the Westridge Protocol to medical school admissions, an initiative that Quantum Sphere's Educational Equity Division was already exploring with its algorithmic bias detection tools. The healthcare applications are particularly compelling, Catherine was explaining. Rural physician shortages persist partly because admissions committees undervalue candidates from non-traditional backgrounds, despite evidence that they're more likely to practice in underserved communities after graduation. Professor Harrington approached, now using a cane but still maintaining his dignified bearing. "Ms. Hayes Morgan, addressing medical education. Your ambitions continue to expand." "The methods transfer surprisingly well across disciplines," Catherine replied with a warm handshake. "How was your European lecture tour?" "Illuminating," Harrington acknowledged. "The Oxford colleges were particularly resistant to examining their admissions practices, rather reminded me of myself 5 years ago. Fortunately, I now recognize the symptoms of institutional arrogance." Their conversation was interrupted as Abby joined them, having finally extracted herself from the student discussions. "Professor Harrington, I'm so glad you could come." "I wouldn't have missed it, Ms. Hayes," he replied, deliberately using her original name, a small acknowledgement of her independent identity apart from her mother's legacy. "Your legal framework for institutional accountability measures is quite brilliant. Harvard Law Review material, I'd say." Abby smiled at the high praise from her former critic. "Already submitted, actually. We'll see if they agree with your assessment." As the reception continued, A young woman in her early 20s approached tentatively. "Excuse me, Ms. Hayes Morgan. You probably don't remember me, but you spoke to me at your graduation 5 years ago. I'm Melissa from Idaho." Abby's face lit with recognition. "Of course. You were our server at dinner. You were starting at Westridge." "That fall." Melissa nodded, clearly touched that Abby remembered her. "I joined the First Generation Alliance like you suggested. Now I'm getting my master's in education policy at Georgetown, and I'm interning with the Department of Education's Equity Commission." "That's wonderful," Abby replied with genuine enthusiasm. "Are you working on the Rural Education Initiative?" "Yes. Actually, that's partly why I wanted to speak with you. We're developing a pilot program to identify high-potential students in rural communities earlier, sophomore year of high school, and provide specialized mentoring and college preparation. We're looking for advisors who understand both the legal framework and lived experience. This exchange, happening just steps away from where educational policy leaders were networking, epitomized what Catherine had envisioned when she first confronted Westridge, not just opening doors for her daughter, but creating pathways for generations of students who might otherwise be overlooked by traditional systems. Later that evening, the Hayes-Morgan family gathered for a private dinner at Catherine and James's Georgetown pied-à-terre, a concession to Catherine's increased public role in educational policy that necessitated frequent visits to Washington. "I have some news," Abby announced as they settled around the table. "The Rural Education Justice Center has offered me their executive director position. They want to expand their legal advocacy work, potentially filing class action suits against state university systems with demonstrable patterns of rural student discrimination." "That's a significant step up from your fellowship," Catherine observed. "Are you ready for the administrative responsibilities?" "The infrastructure is already in place," Abby explained. "They need someone who understands both the legal strategies and the lived experiences of the communities they represent. And with the data analytics quantum sphere has developed, we can document patterns of discrimination more effectively than ever before." James smiled at his daughter. "From rejected applicant to leading national advocacy in 5 years. Not bad for a farm girl." "Speaking of the farm," Abby continued, "my other news is that I've put a down payment on the old Peterson property adjacent to ours in Fairfield County." This revelation surprised both parents. "You're buying farmland?" James asked. 50 acres, Abby confirmed. "I've been working with the Rural Sustainability Network on a demonstration project, showing how technology integration and sustainable practices can make small-scale farming economically viable for new generation farmers. The legal work will be my primary focus, but the farm will be my sanity." Catherine considered her daughter with newfound appreciation. Despite access to wealth and influence, Abby remained connected to her roots while leveraging her position to create meaningful change, the perfect synthesis of her parents' values and her own hard-earned wisdom. "You know," Catherine reflected, "when I landed that helicopter at Westridge 5 years ago, I was so focused on addressing the immediate injustice that I never fully considered the long-term implications." "You couldn't have predicted any of this," Abby acknowledged. "Sometimes the most significant changes begin with a single moment of standing your ground." As their conversation continued into the evening, a news alert appeared on Catherine's tablet. "Department of Education announces comprehensive overhaul of college admissions guidelines. Westridge standards to become federal recommendation." The announcement detailed new federal guidelines, incentivizing colleges to implement bias mitigation protocols in their admissions processes, with specific reference to the success of the Westridge model in identifying overlooked talent in rural and underserved communities. "Congratulations," Abby said sincerely to her mother. "Your corporate takeover of college admissions is now complete." Catherine laughed at the characterization. "Hardly. This is just the beginning of institutional reform. Implementation is where The real work happens, as you well know. And that's where I come in, Abby replied with determination. The legal enforcement mechanisms will ensure these don't remain merely aspirational guidelines. James observed his wife and daughter with quiet admiration, two formidable women who had, in their distinct ways, transformed a personal injustice into systemic change with nationwide impact. Later that night, as Catherine prepared for bed in their Georgetown apartment, she found herself reflecting on the extraordinary journey from that rainy day when Abby had received her rejection letter to this moment of national policy transformation. The helicopter landing that had seemed so dramatic at the time was now merely a footnote in a much larger narrative of institutional change, a catalyst that had sparked a movement now expanding beyond any single institution or individual. What had begun as a mother's protective intervention had evolved into something far more profound. A fundamental reimagining of how institutions evaluate potential and distribute opportunity. The farmer's daughter, whose rejection had triggered this cascade of changes, had become a powerful advocate in her own right, extending the impact far beyond what even Catherine had initially envisioned. As she drifted towards sleep, Catherine found herself remembering something Abby had said during her lecture earlier that day. True equity isn't achieved by making exceptions for individuals, but by transforming systems to recognize excellence in all its forms. That transformation was well underway, ensuring that future generations of students would be evaluated not by their zip codes or family backgrounds, but by their potential, perspective, and promise, a legacy far more valuable than any financial inheritance she could possibly provide. And Professor Harrington, the academic whose arrogant rejection had started it all, had found unexpected redemption in becoming an advocate for the very changes he had initially resisted. Perhaps the most profound transformation of all